Up next, we have Elizabeth A. Povinelli. Beth is a Franz Boas Professor of Anthropology and Gender Studies at Columbia University, where she has also served as director of the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality, and the Center for the Study of Law and Culture. Povinelli is the author of 5 books examining the conditions of late liberalism in settler societies, and as member of the Karrabing Film Collective, she has directed 3 of their award-winning short films. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Povinelli.
Elizabeth A. Before I start, I would like to thank Eflux and the Walker. In particular, I'd like to thank the Walker for this sound, which is, I've been saying it's like listening in the most incredible water. It's amazing and well worth whoever helped us achieve this. What I want to do this afternoon is verbalize some thoughts based on the intersection of the invitation that the Eflux crew extended around their publication and my participation in the Karrabing Filmmaking Collective, where the aesthetic object, in this case, the films themselves, approach a kind of zero position when thought about from the edge of the museological point of view. So what I'm going to do is really talk about what filmmaking is for in the context of Avant museology, what filmmaking is for, or how it works as a kind of truth analytic for the Karrabing, and then what militant filmmaking might be in the space of Indigenous life today, and what that might say about Avant museology. Before I do, just a couple things about the Karrabing itself. Karrabing as a term, as a word, doesn't refer to a clan or tribe or culture or even a particular place. And other than me, it consists entirely of Indigenous men and women, younger and older, who aren't organized or definitely don't conceive themselves as organized in any way that fits a anthropological imaginary. Anthropology and the anthropological imaginary, the way in which it's been used to govern people, is explicitly not, and the against which the Karrabing work. Although most Karrabing are related by descent and marriage to each other, and they all grew up together, and we've known each other for 32 years now, so in some fundamental way, we've all grown up together. Before becoming Karrabing members, before Karrabing was Karrabing as such, the people who are now in Karrabing, including me, had no training in film or arts, had no interest in becoming filmmakers. Love film, but born conspiracy, myself included. So what is Karrabing? Karrabing is an Emmy-angle term for a tide, and an Emmy-angle term for a particular moment in the tides. It's on the coastal the coast up in North Australia. That is when the tide has gone out to its lowest point. It's Karrabing. When it comes to the highest, Karakal. When it's just sitting there, it's Karatin. Karatin, stasis, is no good tide. So Karatin is in some ways an ecological condition, not a place or a people. Indeed, Karrabing is a group of friends and family who found themselves, before they were Karrabing, displaced from a community they all had been born in, and found themselves homeless in the context of two opposing governmental forces that collided in their lives. On the one hand, they found themselves under the long arm of the governance of liberal recognition that provided them with limited forms of state support if they fit themselves into fairly frozen models of the settler imaginary. I'm going to try clicking this. No. Okay. That is, if they allowed themselves to be apprehended as if already in a museum. That is, even though, of course, in contemporary multicultural politics, liberal multicultural politics in Australia, everybody agrees that indigeneity, true indigeneity is not frozen in time. Nevertheless, legislation and law still regards the truest Indigenous person as that person who is least dethawed. And that's so when we're talking about museology and Avant museology, when we're thinking with the Karrabing, they're governed outside the museum by the concept of the museum. On the other hand, in the 2070s in particular, a new vicious form of neoliberalism wafted through, in which there was a demand that Indigenous people liberate themselves from the museum. That is, a very conservative government claimed that Indigenous people have been held in the museum by their very bad white colleagues who wanted them to be frozen, and instead Indigenous people had to be liberated out of the museum, but in a specific way. That is, they had to be liberated into progress, into the Enlightenment, and into entrepreneurial modern culture. It's necessary to understand before we begin then that for the Karrabing, the Indigenous members of the Karrabing, both modes of apprehension within settler colonialism is marked by the settler. On the one hand, the frozen museum is marked by the time that the settler comes. Everything prior to when the settler arrives is the frozen space in which the truth of their lives are governed. And on the other hand, to be broken out of the museum from the settler logic is to enter into progressive time, Enlightenment time, which is marked by the white settler. Thus, Karrabing, and it was in this context that of this intersection of two forces in which they found themselves leaving their community for reasons we can talk about, and homeless, that they, with me, decided that they would begin a film collective. That is, they begin making films that, well, we're going to see why. The point is, before I begin, it's important to note that Karrabing is a query, it's a question, as an artistic practice. Karrabing is a probative concept. It's a probative truth. How does the practice of making films reveal the governance of their existence and the various forms of existence within the Karrabing? That is, how are we differentially governed depending on our epidermal forms, our north-south existence, and the way in which the accumulation of capital flows differentially across those spaces? And how does it reveal the various, and how can this practice of filmmaking contribute to the survivance of a kind of existence that the Karrabing seek to make true in the world? As one of the members, Rex Edmonds, put it, Karrabing means coming together to make something different. So today, just three little things. in the context of the Avant museology, what is filmmaking for? Okay, so let me start with the first question, that question. And I'm going to start by getting a little off track. Oh, how do we do this? Oh, yeah, bah. Perhaps it was the bone-weary fatigue of a laborer in a field or factory that first promoted the thought, fuck it, I will make a perpetual motion machine to replace my body as a carrion of the world's endless cycle of energy and fatigue, motion and rest, sprint and collapse. Or perhaps it was just a dream of pure sovereign motion that once jump-started something, if not myself, could carry forward in a motion unaided or impeded by another thing in or outside itself. Or perhaps the experience of moving without being exhausted in the process was what inspired this notion of a perpetual motion machine. For whatever reason, the desire to make something that makes its own motion without consuming from the inside or the outside is actually quite old. The first designs for a perpetual motion machine came from the 12th century Indian mathematician, astronomer Bhaskara II, and the 13th century artist, French artist, Villard de Honnecourt. That's his. The drawings of these machines are now housed in public museums and private collections. Villard's is located in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. What is also lodged there, though, is not mere design, but the longevity of the human desire to overcome what we now believe are the laws of nature, or a desire to trick those laws into behaving contrary to their nature. But perhaps Villard was not only trying to trick natural law to work against its nature. We don't know much about him, actually, other than he might have been an itinerant metalworker. Nevertheless, if we kind of turn our gaze just slightly to the left or right of this picture here, this object, this design, this machine, to the foreground maybe or the background of it, we might glimpse a different design that Villard had in mind or what he intended his perpetual motion machine to do. In this case, the machine is no longer in it for itself, but it is itself a machination, a subterfuge, a guise for something else. The perpetual motion machine is that old con wherein the eye of the mark is directed toward the birdie so you can pick the pocket more easily. In this case, the focus is on the machine so as to harness energy from one place and redirect it to another. In Villard's case, it might have been a redirection from noble fortunes to the support of his mind and pleasure. I think he probably loved making it, but he had to divert energy to do it. Understood as a redirection machine, that is, machines meant to keep themselves going by redirecting not natural law this time, but social law, to work against its own nature, that is, get those who have money to redirect it to those who do not. Perpetual motion machines might be better understood as MacGuffins, a term that Alfred Hitchcock famously borrowed from his screenwriter, Angus MacPhail. As we know, the MacGuffin is a mysterious object that sets in motion and keeps in motion the chain of events until the film finally winds down and ends. Hitchcock famously described the MacGuffin as, quote, the thing that the characters on the screen worry about, but the audience doesn't care a whit about. Of course, the Hollywood MacGuffin is a far more complex series of redirections. The screenwriters get the actors to chase the thing, so the viewers are fixed on the screen, watching as, in chasing the thing, the actors reveal some aspect of themselves, good or bad or diabolical or evil or whatever. Or one can cut out, say, the psychological depth, like what the viewers are watching the actors to reveal in the act of chasing this thing around. And in films like Bourne Conspiracy, the speed of the action collapses actor and viewer in the same chase. So everybody's going around really fast. Now, producers want screenwriters to rivet viewers in order to move films across theaters and platforms with the ultimate end we know of profit. A really good MacGuffin, then, can keep a film going round and round and round for quite a long time, MacGuffins within MacGuffins within MacGuffins. And a real good MacGuffin can keep a film going long after the final credits have rolled. Why? Because it inspires a looping, a rewind, or a hop across platforms. It urges resources to, indeed, forestall the laws of nature, to imagine they have not taken their toll on the objects moving around in material space. Don't let the film decay. Don't let the digital software become dated. Don't let the machines rust. We now have 3 machines up there, I was told. We have a 35 millimeter, we have an amazing projector that does DCP and every digital platform you ever had. And here we have that tech, what is it called? Tech Rec Tech something, in which we have like 14,000 films going, which is amazing. Oh yeah, right on. Museums and private collections put in a lot of money to restore and restore and restore film, platform, until, as with the Cybermen of Doctor Who, do you guys know who this is? Some of you don't even know. I'm so used to the Commonwealth, where we know such things, the Cybermen, that we're gazing actually at the restoration itself. Right. And for those of you who don't know, this is the original Cyberman. The Cyberman is this terrifying figure in Doctor Who, which is a TV show. And it's, I don't know if they're the vampire or the person who's looking in the mirror with the vampire, but like the point is that at some point in our future history, humans started replacing parts of themselves, right? Until there was nothing left of the human. But what's scary about the Cybermen is they know they are human. They know they are the future human. They're the ones who are going to be the cosmological, cosmos travelers in the future. Now, restoration is a beautiful art, to be sure. And indeed, the art of restoration is now on display in museums. We all know this. So if you go to the Van Gogh Museum, there's a whole section about the art of restoring the Van Goghs. Indeed, if you think about some of the work that people have compared the Karrabing project with, such as Jean Rouche's film *The Jaguar*, the fact that it's a landmark of ethno-fictive cinema developed between Rouche and his Nigerian colleagues, often put like that without names. One of the issues is how and who is going to preserve the actual footage of the film. And again, one of the things to notice here is that someone is being told that they must preserve this film from the ravages of its slow corruption because it's material, even as some Nigerians, many Nigerians, who continue to make films, some of Rouche's immediate colleagues and then generations after that, have to attempt to make these films in a space in which no one's trying to preserve that space as an archive. And here's just an example of the oil leakage that is going on all over Nigeria in the Delta. Here, exactly here, we begin to see how a really good MacGuffin is not merely used to keep the thing within which it is lodged moving, right? So the MacGuffin inside the film moving, but only it, with the focus on restoration, not here. The film itself can be lodged within another thing that allows it to move more, that is the museum, the restoration technologies, and etc. Even if and when rusted and rotted and lodged in museums as curios, such as that perpetual motion machine, which we all know we can't make, actually, the film or that piece of history continues to function as a MacGuffin in a broader sense, because it hasn't outrun its use for creating motion for something or someone else. In this case, film as MacGuffin, rather than the MacGuffin within the film, creates a social motion as people chase the object, now across different social times and different social spaces. Indeed, all things maintain their status as a MacGuffin, all things that have maintained their status as a MacGuffin, that is, something chased, have the hope of entering the museum. They don't lose their propulsive power, even if they're sealed away in the vitrine of history, even if their status as history has been contained and sealed off. They move viewers around and around the revolving doors of the museum or the gallery. As viewers, indeed, go through the winding doors, think of those doors round and round, we can think of those doors as turbines for museum budgets. Sorry, museum, and we love your sound. That is, the moving of those doors at turbines and galleries provides the museum a revolution without end, or as Leon Trotsky said, a permanent revolution. Thus, if for Hitchcock the MacGuffin is nothing, in being nothing, the MacGuffin does a hell of a lot of work. Perhaps it's hardly surprising then that an invitation for me to think about Avant museology would take me to MacGuffins and perpetual motion machines. After all, for our dear departed Soviet colleagues, the Revolutionary Museum was certainly a place of storage and exhibition for objects and icons of revolution. But curators understood or wanted to understand the Revolutionary Museum as a machine for igniting revolutionary action in their viewers. We know this. In following the action as they moved through the museum, that was a history that was narrated to them, they would be inspired to act. Leaving aside some of the snarkiness about the cultural sophistication of the masses, which if you read the book, it's like, wow, woo. Shostakov, I don't know. Andre claims that the Revolutionary Museum should not merely represent world historical uprisings in such a way that they demonstrate scientifically the dialectical modes and social relations of production, but also absolutely must spark a revolutionary flame in the viewer, right? Indeed, the problem of communicating the emotional charge of revolution is specific, he claimed, to the Museum of Revolution, right? That's what it was for. And perhaps the arts of revolution more generally. And here, of course, you know, if you just know 101 in film history, which is all I know, one's more liable to, I'm more liable to remember Andre's contemporary, Eisenstein and Vertov, than this history of museology, who, of course, saw the revolutionary deployment of the dialectical image as not about just watching, but rather initiating. It was a performative. It should initiate you to action. Unless we think, of course, that the dialectical image is specific to the left, whether the Marxists or not. We can, of course, remember that that D.W. Griffiths had the same belief in his racist film, Birth of the Nation. And long before our Soviet friends, of course, the Greek Museum originally marked not a storage, I hate that image, not a storage house, but the place of the inspiring thing, the place where the spirit, you went so that the spirit would enter your person and set into motion the spirit into the world. So you went there, the spirit went in you, then the spirit used you to animate itself into a worldly motion. So the Bloody Museum. It's a storage place of things. We've heard that. It's a place where something is set in motion. When it comes to contemporary art museums, these two tendencies obviously reach maximal stress, especially now in the wake of the aesthetic object as the foremost function of the museum. Nevertheless, and I think really the tension has been in the conference for this last couple days, and when I say the tension, I'm going to, you know, be extreme and say on the one side, on the other side. On the one side still, I think, sits the aesthetic object in its, if not autonomy, it's semi-autonomy. And, you know, we know classic aesthetic theory insofar as we gaze at the aesthetic object produced by the aesthetic genius. We experience a natural law that refuses to be contained by the human thought. The aesthetic object expresses the universal, the disinterested, the purposefulness of the world that can't be contained by intuitions or categories. We know it's a Kant thing. The genius is that conduit, the person who went to the muse place and emerged with a thing that creates a relationship between noumena and phenomena, man and nature or God, that is able to be experienced and judged without being cognizable. Like, you know, yeah, in contemporary art, it's a lot of text there, right? But you want to go, wow, can't quite, wow, blow my mind, baby. It's meaningful without being fillable with meaning. The aesthetic object, the genius brings us from that muse place, allows us to experience the difference between non-human world and our cognitive infrastructure, the categories and the intuitions by which we create and relate the world for us. And, you know, the speculative realists down on that now. Even Adorno's concept of art as a social monad in which the unavoidable tensions within the art world express the unavoidable conflicts within the larger socio-historical process from which they arise, the artwork, and to which they belong, give way in his work to the thing, right? Still the thing. The artwork expresses both its situation and refuses to give way to any conceptual closure of the situation. The artwork we need to store. The artwork we need to preserve. The artwork we need to restore, resurrect, continue. Because after all, the artist will die. Storage place of things, place where something is set in motion. On the other hand of this tension, and again, this is extreme, is a place where something is set in motion. That is, the museum as a place for the inspiring, the set in motion. Here we go to the museum not as a storage house, but a place set apart for study. For a form of study depends on being inspired, right? And what could be better example than these 2 days, right? We go to the museum, we look at some art, we look at art, but we go to the museum to be inspired. The muse will come. We want to have the spirit, right, that comes into our study. I know some of you are probably students, into our study, so as to move the student and thus move the world. And thus the world is what the museum is for, the outside world, the place you go after. Because again, in ancient Greece, as Pierre Hadot long ago noted, the studied inspiration, the idea of studying, the idea of philosophy, the idea of going to the muse place, was a spiritual exercise for living differently in the world as the world was, and thus making the world something different. In this sense, philosophical truth vis-a-vis the practice of being in the muse place was probative versus propositional. And I mean that it's probative, not propositional. There was a set of questions that you left with. Can this thing that I have been given, the spirit, this knowledge, this truth that I've been given, this dialectical flame, revolutionary flame, can this thing in this form that I've been given from the museum place exist in the current arrangements of the various regions of existence that I travel through, and we travel through differently depending on who we are after I leave the museum? Can this thing I've been given divert energy towards what I've been given, so as maybe initially to just make a small place where it could work, right? This truth could work. Just a little bit of space. Can this space, if I could find a little space, I got this truth now, I'm going to go out there. Is it true in the sense, does it work? Can I make a little space with it? Can it be thickened? Can it be extended? Can it be invested now with a formative force? Can it have propulsion? Can this space be kept running for a little while? How long will my machine run? And based on who's begged and borrowed energy. The practices of truth that you get from the muse and the muse place, which is what the museum was for, what this is. These practices of truth are probative analytics of the social arrangements of existence, the differential arrangements of existence, and the forces that keep those arrangements in place, right? So yesterday, I thought it was just an amazing moment when Andrade talked about the cart race. And for those of you who are here, and he said there was a moment, because he gets into this project initially because he wants to forestall a law that is going to exile these horses and carts into the rural area. So he puts on this cart race, but there's a moment in which it's really going to happen, and he realizes that if there's an accident, someone gets hurt, if there's property damage, etc., not only will property be hurt, someone will be hurt, etc., but the political cause that started his art project, that is, can I forestall this law that's going to exile these carts out of this one space to another, could be undone by his actual art project. Right? And this moment in which the question of the muse and how it will work in the world become a probative analytic. Now, it's important, I think, at this point to return to someone like Rouch. Oops. Oh, yeah, that one. Rouch, before turning to my second question, which is, for the Karrabing, what form of truth does filmmaking make and reveal? For it's the disjunctions that open up between Rouch's interest to be, as George Siddall noted, quote, one of the first to give black Africans a voice on international screens, unquote, and his interest in collaborating with his Nigerian friends on the production of beautiful objects on the one hand, and the making of films and the film's movement through the world on another. What is preserved in this process? What is opened? What kinds of spaces, who and why, does the perpetual motion machine of films help us understand? Who's valued, devalued, world or object, what's restored, what's resurrected, and what not. And which side are we going to stand on? The preciousness of the object, where money goes, or the force of its formative and probative relationship to the worlds that exfoliated that object? Or some would say we have to position ourselves in this two-way. There are two sides, you have to decide. You have to decide. Object aesthetic or probative analytic. Object aesthetic or probative analytic. Indeed, some see these two tendencies in hostile confrontation. A little while ago, when I was giving somewhat of a version like this, another professor of anthropology scolded me. Aesthetic judgments, he said, were not based on instrumentalism of the artwork or the beautiful thing, he said. I did not know my Kant, because what I was saying was instrumental reasoning, and that had nothing to do with aesthetics. Now, this professor hated Foucault, truly hated him. So, and I knew it. So I wouldn't have answered him with the reference to Foucault's technologies of the self or the arts of existence. I didn't say that with Foucault we see instrumental reason and the object. We see instrumental reason and the object that serves no end collapse into one another. There's just no difference. To make oneself an artwork, an art collective, to make art a MacGuffin, so as to make oneself into something, is to turn purpose into purposiveness. I didn't say that. For Foucault, is the thing, as a thing, isn't still or the answer any more than the two potential contradictions. If we ask what filmmaking is for the Karrabing Film Collective, we could say that indeed it's a probative MacGuffin. It seeks to use film and artworks that distend out of their films, or our films, to make primarily the indigenous form of existence, truth in the sense of making it work on and work in the world as something that doesn't want them to work. It's neither about the object, the film, the artworks produced, nor is it about the object representing those who create the representation. Instead, the Karrabing Film Collective make these objects as MacGuffins in order to make a movement between object and subject, representation and analytic, probative truth, and in some ways propositionality, such that these oppositions collapse into a specific method of Karrabing filmmaking that I call improvisational realism, but my indigenous colleagues, and in particular Linda Yarwin, calls testing it out, filmmaking as testing it out. That is, the idea that one can always find or mold what one needs in the world that one's in, and that for some, this, let's test it out, is not a choice, it's not something that artists do, but rather is a necessity of the racist impoverishment of settler colonialism. Now, testing it out, improvisational realism, is absolutely not about representing a mediated reality for the Karrabing any more than any other media group. Instead, improvisational realism, or testing it out, is meant to draw a certain kind of topological looping between Karrabing aesthetics and their everyday strategies of living in settler liberalism, where a large gap opens between the resources that they have at hand and what needs to get done with these resources, and where no space exists between the multiple realities that they constitute their everyday life. And in particular, the intersection, as I said in the beginning, between the governance of difference that derives truth from the levels of thawing of the museological indigenous person, and the demands that they enter white settler history, that is progress, in order to escape as if that was what was causing their impoverishment. That is, their everyday world, which is a collision, not a singular mode of governance, but a multiple and colliding modes of governance, through which arts and cinema, governance of difference, governance of markets, nation states, international festivals, cinema, etc., all are colliding at the same time. So let's just begin a little bit. Let me just say a little bit about this MacGuffin business and how it relates to testing it out, improvisational realism. Let me just say a little bit about film production and film aesthetics. So, you know, how are these? There are about 35 people in the group. And literally, in this movie, one of my granddaughters, Chloe Gordon, volunteered to be the sound person. She's 9. So, you know, it just goes, no, but she's a great sound person. It just goes from 9 up and if you're indigenous, your life expectancy is in the mid-50s. So it's part of the materialization of, and the unequal materialization of life within settler colonialism. So the way we started making films was is in terms of plot and scripting and et cetera, has remained consistent. So the plots of the films are for the most part worked out before the shooting starts, and I say for the most part, everything's for the most part. Someone in the group suggests a fairly simple plot, like in this one, it's based on two stories that we're involved in one or the other of these two stories about a boat that broke down and we got stranded. Over time, the idea starts sticking. I mean, I don't know. We've got no real method. It's like it sticks. Something sticks, right? And because more and more people start saying, "Oh, I want to play this or I want to play that in it," and then the subplots emerge, and at some point it feels like there's an arc of a story here, right? And pulled out of things that actually happened. And people position themselves in who they want to play. Either they're playing themselves, kind of, or they're playing people we know really well, like if you're Indigenous, you know the cops really well. So some people want to, you know, play the cop. Some of these conversations happen in formal meetings. Most of the time, story composition happens on porches, on the side of the road, in grocery stores, when we're poaching cows. You know, whatever we're doing together, you know, stories fly around. Locations are selected, but because everyone knows this country like inside out, in some ways the scenes are already in the plot of the movie, whatever the plot is. But the dialogue and the blocking of scenes are completely like made up on the shoot. And indeed, we don't have any script. Gigi once explained, we were having a Q&A, and she said different people in Karrabing have different literacies, and we've decided that nobody should have to not do this because they can't read. So we just do it on. And again, nobody does anything if they don't want to do it, and including if they don't want to do it the day that's supposed to be doing it. And, you know, various people will like try and get everybody to come out and do it by just anything, rolling in the sand, promising to take them to New York, whatever will work. Because it's all tested out. Like, come on, let's just give it a try. You're not committed forever. Let's just do it. Let's do it today. But improvisation doesn't merely refer to both either a performance style, like we'll improv. We'll come up with a story. We don't really write it down. We'll improv the lines. We just, but it also articulates, and more important, it articulates an artistic style to an art of living. In these contexts of extraordinary poverty, initially homelessness, probative analytics of the film and the film's aesthetic really can't be unwound, right? The issues of continuity, of errors in our film, and there's some really howlers. One of my nephews, Cameron Bianamu, he really wanted to play a part in the second movie, Winter to Maru, but he really didn't want to. And in the movie time, it all happens in a day. But he didn't want it, but we were shooting it because we were on industry time, so we were shooting it in a just condensed, I don't know, week, 10 days, I don't know what it was. And he didn't want to wear the same shirt every day because he didn't like that. He just thought that was gross. And everybody knew, and so his mom, Robin, was like, Cameron, remember? Because it's happening in a day, and you're going to... And, you know, he said, oh, Beth can fix it. I was like, how am I going to fix that? I can't fix that. What? So, you know, so he wore a shirt, but you see it. I mean, he's a white shirt underneath this other shirt, a blue shirt, a green shirt. Whatever. Because one of the things that the Karrabing are committed to is that you know, again, the end of this is a MacGuffin. It's to get people moving to become themselves, not to produce, in the end, try and produce the best aesthetic object at all. But if something has to go, we know what it is. Ditto in production, the industry, you know, industry production. Initially, most everybody wanted to focus on coming up with stories and acting, and they didn't want they've seen anthropologists, and we've known each other forever. So I was like, I know anthropologists, like they say, oh, here's the camera and that's politics. And they said, oh, that's crap, man. We don't know how to use a camera. We want to look good, okay? You go to New York and you find a good camera person. And I said, I think there's terrific cinematographers in Australia. And we had a great one, but of course we had to work on industry time, right? 7 days, get up at 6, we don't have lighting, go to, you know, so you shoot till noon and then 4 to thing. And that just doesn't work with the kinds of the life worlds in which people are either want to be in or trapped in. So, for instance, we call being on the phone with the welfare crew as being on dialysis, because you literally can't get off the phone for about 2 hours. So you just sit there and on hold for 2 hours. And if you're on that hold, you're not going to do anything but be on dialysis, welfare dialysis. So we also switched to, I forget who it was, we switched to iPhones. They also, if we got 3 of them, then we could shoot from different angles, and people didn't have to do it again and again, and that meant the younger kids would stay in the films longer because they wouldn't get so frustrated with, we got to do it again and again and again. But again, what appear as aesthetic slippages are actually the aesthetic registers in the films of indigenous life and settler liberalism. Some people in earlier scenes are now in jail, so we have to shoot around them. We could insert extra diegetic footage, but we think allowing unavoidable inconsistency to be in part of the visual field might be more powerful if you even notice it. But ditto with the, let's see if this works. Ditto with the certain art works that extend out of there. I think it's later in the case. If someone just forgot to make the installation that's going to go with the film, then, you know, everybody's like, don't stress out. We'll just grab something where we are and make it. Right. And hopefully make it well. But while we can begin to sketch film as a probative MacGuffin by looking at the intersection of film production and film aesthetics, we remain too tightly trapped within the immediacy of objects and how the objects emerge in the world, rather than the world that is creating the form and direction of the chase that the Karrabing are chasing. More concretely, the question is, how do the circulations of these films provide a probative analytics of the routes that make the worlds that some can move in, but not others? What worlds are already closed down and opened up for whom, what kind of things, what kind of objects, what kind of subjects? So for instance, if we just look at an object, this is the second film. Well, it says what it is. And this was at the Chemical Heritage Foundation. The Winjidamuru, the very quick story of Winjidamuru is, two of the young adult men in the group, Kelvin Bigfoot and Gavin Bionamu, came up with the basic plot. They said, you know, we want this next film to be about, you know, four of us find 2 cartons of beer in the bush, and then the police chase us. And everyone's like, that's cool. But then Linda Yarwin, who I've mentioned before, said, you know, we should show that it's not just that we're drinking all the time, we're looking over sacred sites, so let's put in sacred site rangers, that is, indigenous people who look out for their sacred sites. And then Rex Edmonds said we should put the miners in there then, definitely. So the story kind of emerged as, well, 4 young guys find 2 cartons of beer in the bush. It's their best day on the planet. It's free beer. They're drinking it away. A mining company is illegally about to blow up a sacred site, and the 2 events are occurring in the same place. And so the police are called, chase the young guys through the bush. They wind up in contaminated swamp. In a standout, the police won't go into the swamp because it's contaminated. The young guys won't come out of the swamp because they know they'll go to jail. And the way in which we describe the film are 4 men are in a standoff, 4 young indigenous guys are in a standoff in a chemically contaminated swamp, while all around them miners are stealing the shit out of their country, right? So, and the film is, we know who's going to go to jail. It's going to be the 4 indigenous guys. It's not going to be the miners who are just stealing everything, right? So when the film was shown in the Chemical Heritage Foundation, which is all about a celebration of chemicals in Philadelphia, don't ask me, it wasn't thieving and anthropogenic toxicity that worried the Chemical Heritage Foundation, is that there's a lot of swearing in the movie. So then this little tag had to go on this iPad. Okay. So if you look at the object, you can see one kind of thing. But if you look at the subjects of these, the people making the films, then you see another, of course, infrastructure that starts exfoliating the objects from our view, and we see a different kind of perpetual motion machine emerging that we really saw in the attempt to secure passports for other members of the film collective who were not me. That is, white, North American, and which had accumulated a lot of capital for, you know, basically that. And others who are indigenous Australian poor, right? So, and this illuminates for us as we move the films around. That is, we begin to see they act as these probative analytics where it's like, oh, wow, we didn't even know this was here, right? So as we tried to get passports for folks to go to the Jerusalem show just this last few weeks ago, and we started on this passport business for a while, of course, what do you find out? Well, one thing is that, of course, passports mandate that you're fairly middle class. $44 for a birth certificate, $45 for transportation back and forth to get it, $254 for the passport application, another, I think it was $20 each for the pictures, and then endless amounts of money for fixing endlessly wrong, misspelled names, wrong names, lost paper trails, and et cetera. Why? Because if you're indigenous in Australia, in the north and poor, nobody gives a shit if they write your right name down, right? Because they don't expect you to be going anywhere. So you show up to get your passport, and you have to have identification, and you have identification, but each one has a slightly different name on it. And when you go to get your birth certificate, you find out that your name is not your name because the person who put your name maybe didn't understand what you were saying, and your name is not Kyle, it's Carl, right? So all your other IDs, which have Kyle, are not Carl, right? So endless rounds of trying to fix this. And thus, the infrastructure of aesthetic movement across contemporary artistic infrastructure is part and parcel of what these films as a MacGuffin, that is, setting in motion something that we want people to chase so that members of the group can themselves move further than settler colonialism lets them in general, is part and parcel of the MacGuffin of filmmaking for the Karrabing. In other words, improvisational realism. Oh, yeah, and again, you know, inside Australia, people can move. But when we hit the nation state, the border, so you can't see it if everybody just moves around inside the nation state. You can see other things as you try and move across the nation state, who's smooth, not smooth, et cetera, right? So this is from the Jerusalem show. Oh, and here are these little things that we made as we went along. In other words, improvisational realism and this use of film as a MacGuffin refuses the difference between the aesthetic object and, in some ways, the subject. Instead, it turns each back into the other in order to try and figure out what world people are in. But it also does something more. It doesn't really care about the object itself, even as it strives to make a really good, even perfect aesthetic object. It's like yoga pushing down and pushing up at the same time, all right? So that the object becomes a kind of museum, a place Karrabing try to make a shelter, provide shelter for themselves, even as they're probing how the walls of this shelter can work in the world as it's currently arranged. Thus, even as the museum is a part of a different perpetual motion machine, directing energy from the Karrabing Film Collective, the Karrabing Film Collective tries to function as a means of making that machine, that perpetual motion machine, as something that will exfoliate at least a little energy toward them. Okay. It's thinking of Karrabing films as MacGuffin, I think, that we begin really seeing how films function not to be in a museum, but rather something in which and across which the museum as part of the infrastructure of not art per se, but rather differentiated global existence can be remade. On the one hand, for the Karrabing, and here's a bunch of us, purpose is not the object, again, though the object is something that people love doing, we love doing it. But filmmaking is a MacGuffin that seeks to unfold no thing, if you think Hitchcock, that is a film narrative, into something that is Karrabing, within a current social formation that really attempts to keep the indigenous part of the group nothing, that is irrelevant to the dominant social formation. So all the same questions that we applied to the object, the aesthetic object, can be applied to the collective. Can this thing and this form exist in the current arrangement of various regions of existence? Can this concrete form of the group, which is both specifiable but also open in membership, whose membership doesn't conform to either the notion of the individual creator or even a homogeneous indigenous culture, find the resources or the space to make what it's doing true? That is, to make itself work in the world. And how long can it keep working, and to what end? Oops. That's the perpetual motion machine. There it is. It goes round and round. Right. That's the point. And it goes back and layers back down. Because in the end, and this is Natasha Bigfoot, in the end, when Karrabing members, we were shooting a part of the new movie here, and we were all talking about a question that we'd been asked in I forget where it was. It might have been the Sydney Biennale. And members were asked, where do you want your artworks to end up? And so we were out in this country, and we were all just sitting here chatting here. And Natasha turned and she said, we want them to end up here. And when she said, we want them to end up here, she said, this is our museum, in the sense that everything that we are and everything that our ancestors have been, everything that they had, material and elsewhere, is here. It's the composition of our landscape, their landscape, as the decomposition of themselves, their ancestors, their things, their stuff. And it's in this gesture that's somewhere that insists that it's not a resurrection, it's not a restoration, but it's a continuance of the actual stuff of their lives in another form, right? But for their country and themselves, that filmmaking is ultimately for. Thank you. I think I'm supposed to say any questions. There's one. Oh, I wish I could show a clip. I mean, it's on, the one thing that we don't have in this room is really good Wi-Fi. It's on, they're on Vimeo. One of the things that when we first started making the films, the discussion of theft was on everybody's mind because their land's constantly being stolen. They're constantly, as a people, being either placed in a museum, right, and being looked at as if they were in a museum, or being told to get out of the museum and basically become white, right? And so between these two forces, the question of theft is just a constant part of course, their life, ongoing settler dispossession, but also becomes part of it's an interesting aesthetics that affects the perpetual motion machine, right? Because the first couple films, nobody in the collective paid any attention to the soundtracks we were just stealing, And, you know, I forget who, it might have been Angie, said, you know, hey, Mom, can we put this film in, this music in, this music? I said, I don't know. So we asked somebody, and they said, oh, you're supposed to give a licensing fee. And I think it was Suntu who said, fuck that. Nobody gave us a licensing fee when they stole our land. Let's just steal the music, okay? So we're like, yeah, we're going to steal the music. So we totally stole the music. We stole Lady Gaga. We stole Metallica. So Metallica, at the end of the stealing cunts, we stole, right? Well, you know, and then, of course, it's interesting because the films then can move in specific ways, and then, you know, as many people as possible that basically I or wherever we can find cash to pay for people moving. We can show them in certain contexts, but we can't show them in others. So if we release it on Vimeo, Metallica's going to put a little robot out there and find it. And we could strip it out, but one of the things we talked about, do we want to strip out Metallica? And everyone's like, no, let's not strip out Metallica. What if it doesn't circulate? Who cares? Then it'll be part of the invisible one. It'll show in different kind of places. So it's this constant, like as this perpetual motion machine goes around, I actually mean it seriously. As you hit these barriers, each one of these barriers, like more or less people can get through. Who can get, you know, why can Beth get through everything, right? Why is Beth here? Like as much as possible, we try and have not just Beth here. But so we use that to analyze that, and then we turn that into part of the artwork that goes along with the movies. Like, so when we're going to be at the Contour, we're going to have this whole series about passports, about permits, about et cetera, et cetera. But each moment you go around this perpetual motion machine, of course, decisions have to be made, right? So should we not steal the music? And if we don't steal the music, what are we giving into, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So they are, yeah. And what we do is if you write to there's a website, if you write, then we just send the password. We do it in a different way. So, yeah. I should also say that, just to speak of hopefulness, I don't know what time it is. Someone tell me, is it time to stop? That nobody's hopeful, it's just stubborn. Part of what, and it's really interesting, what keeps people in place is not hope. I mean, it's like, I remember Gigi once saying to me, no, we're not, because anthropologists asked me, and they said, you're against hope. I said, I'm not against hope, I just theorize against hope. And they said, but if your friends must be filled with hope or you guys wouldn't do this. And I said, that's an interesting question. You mean, what's their affect in relation to their practice in the context of ongoing settler racism and dispossession? And they were like, yeah. I said, okay, well, I'm going to wager that what defines us all, what makes us actually like in at least in one register, is we're all stubborn. But I'm not going to. I'm going to go back and I'm going to ask. So I ran back when I was back in Australia, and I asked Gigi. I said, "Hey, Mom, what if you had to say what, like, why we keep doing things? What would you say? What would you say?" And she said, "Because we're stubborn." And that's like. And then we were talking about this, and I said, "Why do you think so?" I agree. I'm stubborn. You're stubborn. Everybody's stubborn. It's their fault, but. Why do you think that? And she said, you know, it's the only thing, nothing good's going to happen. But if you just, it's survivance. It's this notion in Indigenous critical theory of survivance. If you just refuse to stop, you don't have to have hope and you don't have to have disappointment. Right? Yeah. Sorry.
MacGuffin sort of has to go through all these processes of validation.
Yes. Yeah.
That is basically put forward through the same system that subjugates it. So,
well, that's what's that's honestly what this thing is to do. So the question is, and it's what I was answering, as you, and you know, again, it's like, would we ever make another film? How much do people care about the film, the filmmaking, what the filmmaking does for the world? And it is, I think, if everybody's sitting here, all I can say is, like, because we've said it together before, the world is the answer, right? What other people have said in the group is, like, we love the films, we love making them, we like how we make them in our own methodology, but they allow us to come together to see the world we're in, and ever more spatially long, like the world here where we are, the world in Australia, the world internationally. Now, you're right. Every time the MacGuffin goes and people chase it, like, get it out of the film. Like, let's say we're all in the film. They're chasing it, and they chase the makers, and then the probative. Yeah, every time it goes around, the question is the figurative or formative force of the world that it enters and the world that Karrabing members are seeking to change, right? And because it's a radically unequal set of forces, that intersection is part of the probative analytic, right? Because the force of museological reason, of cinematic reason, of art gallery reason is far greater than the force of a 35 extraordinarily poor Indigenous men and women, right? So how do we use this object to try and extend a certain force for the way they in particular want the world to be for them? But yeah, no one's naive. So it's like, how much change goes down? What are you exfoliating back into the ground, coming back up again? Yeah. Thank you.